On the 24th of November 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper boarded a Boeing 727 and told a flight attendant he had a bomb. He demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. Then somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, he lowered the aircraft's rear stairs and jumped into the night. He was never seen again. 9 years later, $5,800 of the ransom was discovered beside the Columbia River. The rest and Cooper himself have never been found. The world knows him as D.B. Cooper, but he never used that name. He called himself Dan Cooper. D.B. came from an early reporting error that has become part of the legend. Eric Ulis has spent years of his life investigating the mystery. His work has appeared on Netflix, the History Channel, and the Discovery Channel, and now centers on the microscopic evidence found on a tie Cooper left aboard the aircraft. Could that tie finally reveal who he was? This is Eric Ulis and the hunt for D.B. Cooper. Eric Ulis, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you.
My pleasure to be here. Looking forward to it.
Do you know what? This case here is one of the most compelling, one of the most frustrating cases that I have ever come across. The hours that I have spent going down rabbit holes with this is off the scale. So you have my respect already. I'm so excited for this conversation. So welcome. But before we get into D.B. Cooper and who he was, I'm interested in you. Who are you? Where did you come from? Where were you born? What were your parents like? Tell me about that.
I was born in Washington, D.C., literally about 2.5 miles from the White House. My parents immigrated to the United States shortly after World War II from Latvia, one of the Baltic nations. My father ended up working with NASA. He was involved with all of the moon shots, all of the space activity in the 60s going into the 70s and into the 70s. Now, he didn't work for NASA. He actually worked for a subcontractor company called Univac, which was a computer company, again, in the 1960s. So he was right on the cutting edge of all that stuff. But, I've always been interested in aviation. Ever since I was a little boy, I was interested in aviation, airplanes, wanted to be a pilot. However, I'm colorblind. I have a problem between certain shades of green and brown, which doesn't work very well if you're flying a 747 or anything else for that matter. But so the dreams of becoming an airline pilot kind of were dashed long ago. But we ended up moving out west. My father got transferred with his company out west. So I grew up in Salt Lake City area, Utah. So I consider Utah my home state, Salt Lake City my hometown, even though I haven't lived there for many years. I currently live in Rhode Island, which is one of the New England states on the east coast of the United States, just a little bit south of Boston. But my background is somewhat interesting in that I came from the world of professional card counting blackjack.
Okay.
If you think of the movie 21 with Kevin Spacey and the MIT guys that would travel to Vegas weekly and, this high stakes game of cat and mouse with the casinos and trying to win, hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's literally the world I came from. That's the kind of thing I was involved in all through the 90s up into the early 2000s. And I've said this many times before that while there seems to be absolutely no connection between card counting and professional blackjack to cold case mysteries like the D.B. Cooper case, I actually beg to differ. What I learned and just sort of my experience for all the years of playing blackjack, which is it's absolutely objective. I mean, if you're a winning professional card counter, it's completely objective. There's very little, if any, subjectivity to it. And you learn that if you're going to get ahead in this game, if you're going to succeed, you can't let emotion play a part in any of your decisions. It's got to be strictly math-based, and you've got to do things according to the odds and that type of thing, irrespective of the bad luck that you may have experienced recently or the good luck you may have experienced. And it's really that skill set that I brought forward into looking into some of these cold cases, D.B. Cooper specifically, which is what I'm actually primarily known for, obviously, is my work on the D.B. Cooper case. And it's one of those things that, I mean, I've been aware of the case since the late 70s, and I had sort of a passing interest over the years, but it was really probably about 2007 or so, I'd say, 19, 20 years ago now, that I really kind of jumped in, full force. I realized, hey, this is still a mystery, and you know what, I feel like I could probably figure this thing out, because I'm just one of these guys that relishes a challenge, whether it's the Rubik's Cube or, beating the casino at their own game, or, trying to figure out who the hell D.B. Cooper was. So that's kind of a bit about my background and where I came from. And and like I said, one last thing, it's one of those things where it started out to me as just sort of a guilty pleasure, investigating the case and just trying to see if I could solve it. And it just sort of accidentally kind of morphed into something much bigger. So I ended up headlining a History Channel show about this. I was part of a Netflix show related to D.B. Cooper, Discovery Channel, and those kind of things. So it just kind of took upon itself a life of its own over time. And here I am today, basically really kind of deeply involved in all this and pushing the ball forward and trying to figure out who this guy was.
First of all, I absolutely see the link between the mind that you have in blackjack and thinking of all of those strategies and different things, the concentration, as you say, the cat and mouse. I see that link. Absolutely. I get that. Now, D.B. Cooper is one of these things. I mean, basically, somebody has blamed virtually every person who was alive, virtually, for this and the Zodiac case. I think that's another one where literally the most outlandish names come. And, okay, someone could turn around and say, well, it could have been this person. Well, yeah, okay. Quite. You're fine to go down that road if you want, but bring something that looks like evidence, that has some substance to it. Now, off air, I was saying there are some very well-known people who've been associated. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., because he did a copycat, or if we said it was Richard Floyd McCoy, the one he was caught for was the copycat of his own one. Or Robert Rackstraw, who refused to say it wasn't him. So, and this man, he had a very interesting life. Forget about him being D.B. Cooper. I mean, his life was quite interesting. And there are countless other people who've been associated. But what you've done is really interesting. You have come to the table with not just another idea of who it could be, but you are trying to use science. You are trying to use genuine evidence and real kind of detective work to go down, and it could be a rabbit hole again, but, I really rate what you're doing. And it's as compelling to me as McCoy or Rackstraw and the people who wholeheartedly believe in them. And if you ask me, do I think it's them? Possibly. But if you ask me, do I think your theory's right? I could absolutely get behind that too. And it's one of the very best I've heard. So could you give us a little bit of flavor? You got into this 2007. We've gone on almost 20 years since then. You started probably in the same way I did, looking at what was out there already, kind of looking at who said what and the cases. But where did it elevate from a passing interest into what you have done now, which is really kind of get involved with this case on a deep level and turned a lot of people against you, haven't you? Because, when people disagree, and they disagree passionately on this case, if you say something that does not fit their person, you are done. You are, basically thrown out of this world, and gone, no, you don't agree with me, so, I've got no time for you. So where did this come from?
Well, it's interesting because you're right. I mean, I'll just speak specifically to the D.B. Cooper case. You've got some very strong personalities and people that are what I call them basically suspect peddlers. They have their guy and they're not going to let go of this guy no matter what. And I think that speaks somewhat to the human condition in the sense that I think a lot of this is people sort of grappling for their 15 minutes of fame. They want to be known as the person who solved the D.B. Cooper mystery, whether they actually pegged the real guy or not. They just kind of like the whole idea, relish the notion, the idea of being, on the D.B. Cooper Wikipedia page as the person who solved the case or whatever the case may happen to be. So there's some of that I would just call sort of dishonest aspect to it. And yeah, you get people that if you have someone like myself who's actually very public in terms of, I've been on the media extensively, whether it's CNN or Fox News or CNBC or whatever, plus the shows, you kind of become a target for everybody who disagrees with you. But I got a pretty thick skin. I really it just kind of comes with the territory, so I don't really care. It just is what it is as far as that goes. But, I feel very comfortable leaning into the evidence as I understand it. Again, I've said this many times before. I don't get to choose who D.B. Cooper was. D.B. Cooper decided that for himself nearly 55 years ago. And, so my job as a serious researcher is to, analyze the tea leaves, look at what we've got to work with, the hardcore physical evidence and witness evidence and things of this nature, testimony and so forth, and try to, solve the riddle. Because at the end of the day, that's all this is. It's just a very complicated riddle. And so in particular, I've focused a lot on D.B. Cooper's tie because he had a skinny black clip-on tie that he wore on the jet. He bought it for $1.49, or it cost $1.49 brand new from JCPenney. And I believe he acquired it somewhere. I say for argument's sake, I say he acquired it Christmas 1964. So that's about the time that the tie was acquired. But importantly, it was left behind on the jet and was retrieved in Reno, Nevada when the plane landed, and the authorities obviously took control of the jet. And in 1971, it was of very little evidentiary value. It's 1971, no DNA testing, scanning electron microscopes weren't really a thing, But nowadays, if you look at that tie, there's been an enormous amount of data and evidence that we've pulled off of the tie, specifically related to sophisticated metals, titanium, pure titanium, titanium alloys, rare earth elements, zinc, aluminum, stainless steel, all kinds of different minerals. What appears to be a particle of cumberlandite, which is a rock basically that is only found in one place in the entire world, which is a 4-acre plot of land just up the road from me here in Rhode Island. It's a combination of basically iron and titanium. So, there's just interesting things on there that I think speak to where D.B. Cooper worked, where he came from. And I just feel very comfortable leaning into that and trying to understand the story that the evidence is speaking to, the truth that the evidence is speaking to. The truth, the evidence, the science, the truth, it doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't care what you or I think about. It doesn't care about, our biases or whatever the case may happen to be. The truth is the truth. And again, my job is to try to figure out who the real guy is. And I just feel comfortable latching onto, diving into, attaching, myself to the evidence and trying to decipher the evidence to the best of my ability.
I think what's interesting, D.B. Cooper, obviously he didn't even give himself that name. He gave himself Dan Cooper. So, the most famous thing attached with him, which is the name, that is an illusion right there. Right? He did not give himself that. And I find that utterly ironic, to be honest. That we're trying to chase a guy that didn't even give himself that name. It's, Dan Cooper. And isn't it amazing how all of this so-called circumstantial evidence, all of these rumors, all of this conjecture, all of this stuff comes into play here. But actually, all you're left with are some very basic facts. Somebody lost, and I have, yes, those cigarette butts, and don't get me started on that. For me, that's, I don't know what happened there, but that's unbelievable to me, and they're gone. And that would have obviously been, potentially end of story, shut down. We know who it is, especially with all the things and leaps in genetic genealogy and, all of those. That would have probably shut the case down if those turned up. That is, gold. But D.B. Cooper left on the plane this tie with the mother of pearl clip, and it is the most ordinary tie on earth, right? It is cheap. Mm-hmm. There's nothing exciting about it. It's, a tie. Yet it is the one thing. Obviously there's the ticket, but that was filled out, and you are looking at the one piece of evidence that really does exist, that we know he physically had on him. So I get why you would go after this. Now, some people could say, well, how do you know it was his tie? Or, okay, he had it on the plane, but what if he bought it 10 minutes ago and, just or took it off someone, swapped it? Before we dive in, that is a theory that I've heard you have to deal with. This, what if it's not his tie? What if somebody else owned his tie? But still, it's what you've got, isn't it?
Well, a couple of things here. First of all, just to clarify something that you said that is often repeated, but it's incorrect. The cigarette butts were not lost. They were actually destroyed. They were destroyed purposely by the FBI.
Yeah,
and I've seen this in the FBI. I've seen this in the FBI documentation. So when there were 8 cigarette butts that were left behind. DB Cooper was smoking cigarettes on the jet. He actually invited the flight attendant Tina Mucklow to have a cigarette with him, and she took him up on it. So presumably one of those 8 is her cigarette butt, and the other 7 are from DB Cooper. But 71, they were sent off to Quantico in Virginia here. Trying to see if there's anything they could pull from them, fingerprints specifically. Of course, there's no DNA testing at this time. They didn't get anything of value off of the cigarette butts, and they were just destroyed, which obviously in retrospect is an epic mistake. Also, there were a couple of hairs. There was a hair from someone's head, and a limb hair as well that were found on the headrest napkin or tissue or whatever that's would be behind your head on the chair there. Those have been misplaced. Those 2 hairs have been misplaced. So there's nothing in the documentation that describes what happened to them, whether they were destroyed or they ended up in some field office in Helena, Montana, and they're just sitting there right now. We just don't know. But so that is actually, those have actually been lost there. But as far as the tie and whether it was DB Cooper's or not, the reality is that DB Cooper was wearing the tie, and he took it off and he left it on the chair, and I believe that was an oversight. I don't think he intended to leave it on the chair, for the authorities to collect. So at least for a few hours there, that was DB Cooper's tie. There's no debating that. And obviously he had some sort of interaction with the tie. But, it's important to remember that in 1971, the tie was somewhat dated. 1971 was the era of the wide ties with the, flashy neon green kind of coloring and that type of thing. This is a much more conservative, skinny black clip-on tie. And it's worth considering that there were things that unfolded on the flight that seemed to pretty clearly indicate that DB Cooper was at a minimum familiar with aircraft and airplane, air travel, aerospace, whatever the case may happen to be. They immediately started looking at Boeing, and employees or former employees of Boeing, because he demonstrated knowledge that was not typical. Now, fast forward 40 years, And you got the discovery of, all these very sophisticated metals and particles on the tie that just so happened to be consistent with the aerospace sector in the 60s and the 70s. So that's either one hell of a coincidence if he happened to pick it up at Goodwill, or he stole it or something of that nature. He just happened to steal a tie from somebody in that sector, which is exactly what it looked like D.B. Cooper's from the very beginning, or it was D.B. Cooper's tie from the beginning. So as a betting person, I'm going to play the odds on this one. I'm going to say that tie was his from the very beginning, and you got to go with that. You got to go with that.
I agree. I don't think that logically it makes sense any other way.
That's correct. It is illogical. It just doesn't make sense why somebody would. I don't know. I mean, it's just a cheap tie. It's something that he wore to, dress himself up, and that's that. So nothing too complicated. I think a lot of times people overthink it and think it's some sort of fifth level chess move. And again, it's important to understand that this is 1971. This isn't 2026. It's it wasn't. It couldn't provide any real material evidence, or was of very little value in 1971. It just so happens that 50 years later, it's of enormous value.
So the tie itself is this interesting thing because there is this, like a piece of metal, right, where you kind of adjust. And that is not on the, it's obviously, let's say, harder to degrade than the tie, which has, we have to at least say, many people have looked at this tie across time. This tie it was on the plane, it was taken off the plane. Countless people say they've done spot testing on it or looked at it. But yes, these rare earth elements back then were, as you say, just not used. There were very few. I think you have pinned it to a specific place, but no one was using this stuff.
Yeah. One of I think you're referring to a titanium and antimony particle. There's a few particles of a titanium and antimony. And I discovered this particle buried in the data, the tie particle data. There are hundreds of thousands, a couple 100,000 particles there. And if you look at the spreadsheet, it kind of has the breakdown, the chemical breakdown of all these 100,000 particles or 200,000 particles. But buried in the data, I noticed that there were a few particles of this titanium and antimony alloy, which was not commercially produced or disseminated in the 60s. I also found a U.S. patent that seems to sort of correlate with it. So that was granted to a company in Pittsburgh called Remcrew Titanium, later known as Crucible Steel. They happen to have a big business. They happen to do a lot of business with Boeing as a subcontractor supplying specialty metals. Now, part of the problem is that we're dealing with these very small microscopic particles. You can't be 1,000% certain that the titanium and antimony is exactly what's coming out, from the scanning electron microscope. I mean, there are, you could have a particle of antimony and a particle of titanium that are just sitting next to each other that are being read at the same time, for example. And, so without actual, clear photographs, it's hard to verify some of this. But having said that, there does appear to be, some unique particles like that. And in the case of the titanium antimony, it points to a specific company, not to suggest that it was, couldn't be found anywhere else. But you certainly, go to the place where that was working on it in the 60s and was granted the patent and everything else related to it. But that's the kind of investigative work that I think ultimately it's going to lead to success in figuring out who this guy was, because the tie presumably was an item that he wore to work. And if we can figure out where this guy worked and, throw in some other metrics into the mix, how tall the guy was, how old he was, all these kind of things, did he lose his job in 1971, whatever the case may happen to be, what was his appearance, all of those metrics and everything start to bring a person into focus. And that's ultimately, I think, what I'm trying to accomplish here is sort of put enough of the puzzle together to figure out who this guy was.
So when I started listening to some of your interviews and different things, it was when you got to the particles and then you talked about the pattern, and I thought, all right, this is interesting now. There is something here. This is really worth looking at. And this level of time that you have taken, to look at this stuff, is incredible, because to break this case, to actually get to a point, as you say, where, and we're going to have to use the authorities as being the judge of this, but for the authorities to go, yeah, okay, we have got the evidence here to seriously say that, we may not be able to build the case or whatever, but this is good. This is, as far as we're concerned, we're convinced. To get to that point would be extraordinary, but you are putting in groundwork here that only someone who really, truly believed that this was, first of all, accurate would do. So anyone who just thinks, you're running off and doing, wasting your time is not right, because this is as good a line as I've seen. So, I give you true credit for that. I mean, it's, the work effort that you've put in is unbelievable.
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of work, and it's complicated by the fact that it's been nearly 55 years. You've got a lot of company records and so forth that no longer exist. You have companies that no longer exist. Obviously, many people have died, passed on.
Yeah.
Memories fade, evidence is lost. A lot of stuff happens in 55 years. And, and I should say as well that the FBI hasn't helped.
No.
They closed the case, administratively closed the case in July of 2016. So it's been over 10 years now. And I actually tried a few years ago to get access to the tie briefly with a DNA specialist, because I located a part of the tie that we thought that may actually contain an uncontaminated DNA profile of D.B. Cooper's. And the FBI pushed back. They were unwilling to play ball. I ended up suing them in federal court and lost. I was unsuccessful. I knew it was somewhat of a Hail Mary, but that's part of the problem here, is that I'm trying to lean into and leverage evidence and tools and things that are, kind of just out here in the public domain. It would be really, really nice if we could actually get our hands on the tie. And, again, the tie is in Washington, D.C. It's at FBI headquarters. I've seen the tie. I've actually personally seen the tie there at headquarters. I was unable to touch it or what have you. But, if we could just get access to it for 15 minutes with a specialist right there at the FBI office. It's under their control. We're not, swapping it out or anything else. It's right there. And then, of course, expend private resources to analyze whatever we managed to pull from the tie. I mean, that could break the case wide open. So it's somewhat of a mystery as to why the FBI hasn't been willing to play ball with respect to us on this. But that's been frustrating, because I actually think that we could probably pretty easily solve this case. Again, leaning into leveraging 2026 technology, specifically with DNA testing and scanning electron microscopes and the like. I've said this many times before that, time has served as a double-edged sword in this case. In one sense, you've had, people that have passed, memories of fate, evidence is lost, things of this nature. But on the flip side of that equation, you've got advances in science and technology that are opening up doors and avenues and lines of investigation that you can only dream of in 1971. And ultimately, I think that science and technology is going to win out. Ultimately, it's going to be that is going to crack this case, and we're going to be able to figure out who this guy was. The guy can't run away from the truth. It may take 50 or 60 years for it to happen, but eventually that science, that technology is going to finger this guy.
Yeah, I think that in reality, unless someone has missed came out of the plane, died on the spot. Something is uncovered in due course. I don't believe that, by the way, but let's, that's one possibility. But I don't buy into that. The money mysteriously turns up somewhere in someone's house who happened to be, a very good, culprit with a parachute. Yeah, I'd find that utterly compelling,
Yeah.
But we're not left with this. We're left with, the tie. And unless something incredible turns up, and it could, it's possible. But unless it does, we're kind of where we're at. The FBI, look, there are lots of people who have aimed things at the FBI. Was there some CIA operative, Rob Rackstraw? Let's go to him. Maybe he was. I don't know. And were they trying to cover something up? Was the person on the plane trying to show how awful the security was? And was this a ploy to up the security levels at, airports to prevent X, Y, and Z? All of these things. And people will make conspiracies unless the FBI just go, well, we've got nothing to hide. Here it is. Here's everything we got. We're happy if, someone comes and tests it again based on this technology now. We've given you all the documents we've got. We're not going to spend any more time on it. And if we ever find anything else, we'll make it available. But it doesn't look great on them. Whatever the motive is or is not, it doesn't look great. It does feel like there is something that people don't know, whether that's true or not.
I think for a couple of things. First of all, I'm a big subscriber to the Occam's razor theory, which is basically says the simplest explanation is usually the closest to the truth. So I'm not prone to believe conspiracies because they just invariably they fall apart over time. I think with the FBI, if I had to hazard a guess, I think they're afraid of opening Pandora's box. And what I mean by that is I understand that they cannot entertain every citizen sleuth who happens to come along with a theory and hand over evidence, whether it's D.B. Cooper or the JFK assassination or, Zodiac, whatever the case may happen to be. But I think that in the case of D.B. Cooper, it's unique in this sense that the case is closed. It's been, again, administratively closed since 2016. Moreover, I like to think that I've got a certain stature in the community, and especially partnering with a forensic DNA specialist. We're not just Joes off the street who have some crazy harebrained scheme or what have you. We're obviously credible, serious individuals that bring something to the table as far as this is concerned. So you would like to think that they would be able to sort of delineate between kind of the everyday person who just has a crazy theory versus the serious individual who may actually have the potential, have an idea that can crack this case and solve this case once and for all.
And you look at the cases that are being solved now. So I'm going to go to the biggest one, which is, for me, the Golden State Killer. So Joseph James DeAngelo, who was solved through genetic genealogy and the work done on that. And I've, done an episode on that. I've done an episode with Derek Abbott, who solved something called the Somerton Man. And the evidence was, really degraded there. There was a plaster cast placed on this man who was found in Adelaide, and embedded in the plaster were hairs. And those hairs, he tried them every 3 years, virtually every 3 years, and sent them to all kinds of specialists until eventually, they were able to get the DNA results that they needed. And it was a labor of love, to keep coming back and trying again. And yes, that is the only real logical way Unless, as I said, the treasure trove exists somewhere where, in someone's closet, that money is there and they go, yeah, he was, we knew all along. And they've got some compelling thing and they can prove it. But I agree, the FBI probably are just, yes, they must get a million things, a million people going, I've got this, I'm all over this. I've got, it was my Uncle Joe, who wasn't even born, because some of the people who've been connected with some of these things, politicians and so on, and different things, you're just like, no. People still believe Elvis is around. People have got it. There are a lot of conspiracies that go down. Elvis was in Home Alone or something, and there's a lot of things that go on. But
that would be cool if Elvis was still around. I'd pay to see the guy in concert today. Obviously, so
me too.
Yeah, I'm a big Elvis fan. So big Elvis fan. Yeah,
he was an awesome dude. You know what? So, but you didn't just stop there. You looked at this company. You highlighted, a place, and you didn't just go, oh, that's good. You went and looked. You spoke to people. You uncovered possibilities, and how did that, were people helpful? How did that come together?
Well, I think it's worth noting, and I don't think that this is hyperbolic, I pretty much am the quasi-FBI at this point on this case. I mean, I actually am getting out in the field. In fact, I've got an on-the-ground search taking place in Washington State in under a month here, again, looking for the parachute, that kind of thing. So I think that's one thing that also sets me apart from a lot of others who are looking at this case, is I'm actually out, boots on the ground and obviously interviewing people and going to locations and, putting eyes on certain things and doing reenactments and all kinds of things like that to try to put myself in D.B. Cooper's shoes and understand what must have happened, what took place. But, again, I mean, I just think that ultimately is what's going to take to solve this case, to figure out who this guy was. It's important to, believe it or not, part of the challenge is it's easy to lose sight of the fact that this is real. This really happened. There was a real guy, a real D.B. Cooper. And it's easy to kind of think of D.B. Cooper in terms of the grainy black and white news footage you see from 55 years ago. But, I think of somebody like a Bill Mitchell. Now, Bill Mitchell was a then 20-year-old college student who basically sat next to D.B. Cooper. There were only two people in the back row of the airliner, two passengers. One was D.B. Cooper, one was Bill Mitchell. And Bill Mitchell actually eyeballed this guy quite a bit, because the flight attendant ended up coming and sitting down next to him throughout the entire flight. She was 23 years old. And Bill Mitchell, who was 20 years old, kind of had the hots for the flight attendant. He was trying to figure out, why is this flight attendant, paying all this attention to this old guy, that right, in the group of seats right next to me. So he basically sized D.B. Cooper up. But I know Bill Mitchell very well, and sometimes I have to remind myself, this guy, Bill Mitchell, actually saw D.B. Cooper, the real D.B. Cooper, the real guy. This guy, was there the entire time and experienced the entire thing and saw this guy. And I think that's very cool. And, to be sure, there isn't much that I can glean from Bill at this point, because it's been an extended amount of time, and we're best to focus on the FBI 302s, the initial comments of the passengers and recollections of comments and passengers and so forth, versus trying to rely upon memories 55 years later. But having said that, I do think, it's kind of an irreplaceable moment when you can actually get out there and meet some of these people personally. And like the pilot, Bill Radicek, who was the co-pilot, who was kind of, I don't want to say took the lead, but he was really front-facing in a lot of respects with respect to how this whole thing unfolded during that event. I talked with Bill on a number of occasions as well. Now, he passed away within the last year, but there are things that he recalls happening, and as he had relayed things to me, I kind of note these things and try to understand how it all fits together. But I think that's what it takes. That's invaluable, and And again, like I said, at this point in time, I am the FBI when it comes to this case. And, so taking it full circle here, it sure would be nice if they would, they don't have to give me FBI credentials, but at least help a brother out, man. Let us in and let us check out the ties that we come up with, and let's just go with that, And then it's also important to remember, too, that a portion, $6,000 of D.B. Cooper's ransom, a portion was found 8 years after the skyjacking, buried in the sand, buried on the beach. So there is that second piece of evidence, which speaks to its own story.
I mean, the money is, it's one of these things that is very fascinating. You look at that, on the face of it, it leads you to believe that obviously somebody jumped, lost the money. That is the most natural explanation for that. Someone likely either did not secure the money well and lost it and survived. It certainly doesn't say they did not survive. That money does not do that. Or, obviously, it was buried at a different time. It came from sediment, but all of the other DNA of that, and the checking of, degrading of, rubber bands and notes. It's a rabbit hole on its own. And I mean, if D.B. Cooper was this smart cookie who would just put that money there, a Tena Bar to essentially wind people up, I mean, this dude didn't kill anybody that we know of. He did do what he did, but he's made out to be like essentially like a rock star. This dude is the coolest cat in town. But fundamentally, he held a plane hostage and caused all kinds of chaos. And people are still living with the consequence, of that. More probably the fact that, they haven't been able to live a life without having to have somebody. Tina Mucklow, people like that, They've gone through a lot. It's unavoidable. It's unavoidable. But
I think, go ahead.
No,
please.
please.
No, I think a couple things here. The money, there's a lot that we've been able to learn from the money find. And there's the money itself is, we've applied science to that as well. And there are a lot of other things that go into understanding exactly where the money was located and everything else that makes it very, very clear to me. I'm 100% certain that D.B. Cooper buried the money there probably on the night of the skyjacking. So whether he landed nearby or whether he landed 30 miles away, for whatever reason, he came to the beach and he buried the money there at the beach, and I believe it was temporarily. And I believe he buried all of it. I believe he buried the bank bag with, a bunch of money, and I think there were some loose packets that he also threw into a hole, into the same hole. And then presumably sometime later came back under cover of darkness and retrieved all of it, just accidentally left 3 of the packets behind. If he had, carved 3 inches to the left in the sand, he would have uncovered those 3 extra packets there. So I think that I'm absolutely convinced that tells us D.B. Cooper survived, and that for whatever reason he made his way there. There are a number of we can theorize about that as well. And there was one other point I was going to make as far as this, but it kind of just slipped my mind there talking about the money. But so yeah, I mean,
so the money. I mean, the theory you've just given. I could absolutely believe that. Totally makes sense. You are trying to survive. You're trying to get yourself away. You don't want to have this money on. You don't know who's looking for you. Come back for it again. There are obviously those theories that someone came, and I find that harder to believe, that someone just came to Tena Bar at some point and just buried some money to wind people up. I don't really buy that one. I mean, is it infeasible that it was lost? No, that's not infeasible. I know there's a lot of reasons that, but it's not impossible. I think the one you have explained makes sense. I could definitely say that is as likely as anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think, I mean, again, I'm 100%. There are very few things in this case I'm 100% convinced about. And one of them is that the money was buried by a person. And if the money was buried by a person, that person was probably D.B. Cooper.
Yeah.
And just factoring in the condition of the money, you've got 3 separate packets stacked on top of each other, everything else, it clearly had been there for a very long period of time. Even though it was buried on the beach, it wasn't exposed to the river. It was quite a ways, about 50 feet from the river, and at an elevation about 9 feet above the level of the river under normal conditions. There were a couple of occasions where the river flooded and actually reached that spot. But there's also some scientific evidence that has been pulled from some of the money that indicates that the money was not exposed to the Columbia River the night of the jump. In other words, we know with certainty, scientifically, that money did not end up in the river that night it jumped, because he jumped in November. And there are these things called diatoms, these little very small microscopic, like glass-like organisms in the river. And there are different species between winter and summer. There are some diatoms on the bills, but they're actually summer diatoms. So it was exposed to the river during the spring, summer, but not the winter when he jumped. So I think that speaks to when the money was actually retrieved. I think D.B. Cooper came back and retrieved the money about 7 months later during a flooding event on the Columbia River. And I think that explains the diatom evidence and a few other things as well.
Interesting. It's really interesting that you've followed down the rabbit hole with that as well. And the money it's compelling. It adds to this story. It really does. I mean, it's so bizarre and random, and how it was found, and the people who found it, it's all interesting. So
It is all very interesting. And I remember what I was going to talk about before in terms of, just sort of how people view D.B. Cooper. I mean, there's, it's kind of the folk hero kind of aspect to the guy.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to consider where America was in 1971. I mean, it was a very tumultuous time in American history. We had the assassinations of, President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., in the preceding, several years. We had the Vietnam War taking place. We had an event at a university called Kent State, which took place several months before the skyjacking, where the National Guard actually killed 4 students, protesters, and protesting the Vietnam War. There was race issues going on in the United States back then. So it was just a tumultuous time in U.S. history. And frankly, there were a lot of people who basically had it with the authorities. They weren't liking what they were seeing in the country. So they kind of basically relished the notion of a guy kind of sticking it to the man, sticking it to the feds, And you see this in the contemporaneous news coverage. People talking about, interviewing people about D.B. Cooper, the guy who just jumped an hour the day before, whatever. And you got him, people describing him as a pretty cool cat. I hope he gets away with it and all this kind of stuff. So, if you're an FBI agent, or if you're the authorities, you couldn't really count on the public to help, which is another interesting, dimension that you have to factor into this case. That maybe somebody actually came across the guy and assisted him to some degree, but was be like, I'll be damned, I'm not going to, rat the guy out because, screw the feds. And now all these years later, this person may still be around, or there may be stories in the family about this, but they still don't want to talk about it publicly because they're afraid that, they may be somehow liable legally or something of that nature. Who knows? But so there's a lot of interesting possibilities as far as this is concerned.
So you have your theories, right, of potentially who could be D.B. Cooper. And they're very compelling. You have done extensive work in looking at who is working at this particular time, at this particular place. Very interestingly, what they wore to work and why a clip-on tie could be a very useful thing to have had in that company based on the technology and machinery and so on that they were using. And I find that very interesting. Could you share that a little bit, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, sure. It was a clip-on tie, and if you're around machinery at all, lathes or saws or what have you, you want to be wearing a clip-on tie just in case that tie happens to get caught up in a piece of equipment. You can imagine that if it's a regular tie, that you're going to break your neck. It's going to kill you, literally. Clip-on tie, it just gets snapped right off. Police officers today, to the degree that they wear ties, and you see some of that out there still, those are clip-on ties. So that the bad guy, if he grabs the police officer's tie, can't drag the cop around. It's just a clip-on tie and it comes off. So, that's really the important thing as far as that's concerned. It's also worth considering that the guy wore a tie. So, there are a lot of people, there's an entire class of workers, maybe working in machine shops and those kind of places, that you can basically say, no, it couldn't have been D.B. Cooper because these guys didn't wear ties. I mean, these guys wore, overalls and things of that nature. So by virtue of the fact that he apparently wore this tie extensively, based upon the amount of evidence on the tie, that seems to suggest that he's somebody that's in at least middle management level or an engineer or something of that nature. I don't know. I tend to believe that the identity of the true D.B. Cooper, the real D.B. Cooper, has not been revealed at this point. I tend to believe that nobody that we've discussed is D.B. Cooper. I also tend to think, just based upon the latest as I've continued to investigate this, that he probably came from the Pacific Northwest. He probably came from either Washington State or Oregon. There's an area of Washington State called the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. They had a facility there called the Pacific Northwest Laboratories that was a scientific laboratory, basically, that dealt with some of the metals and stuff we're talking about. They were associated with the Battelle Memorial Institute, which I know is probably, most people probably don't know what that place is, but they're a well-known place in the United States of scientists and so forth, not-for-profit, developing sort of cutting-edge materials and things in the metallurgical world and science and other places. They've been around for a long time. So I tend to think that something like that, someplace like that, is probably where D.B. Cooper came from. If I had to put a finger on it, I would say he probably came from that Pacific Northwest Laboratories. They're part of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Washington State, which is kind of situated kind of in the middle, sort of off to the side, but in the middle between Seattle and Portland, between Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, which is where this all took place, basically. So, I'm also on the record as saying I do believe that that's entirely possible before the end of this year that we figure out who the guy was. I think that's possible, and that's what I'm actively working on right now, is trying to determine who this guy could have been, and then try to figure out exactly who he was.
So, two questions. First question goes a little bit like this. So, this guy, right? He obviously went onto this plane. He had the idea to do what he was going to do. We know that. We know that this wasn't something he just came up with whilst he was there. This did require some genuine. The fact that he put a wrong name. We know that this wasn't something he concocted. His whole demeanor, the whole persona, what he was wearing, the sunglasses make it Hollywood worthy already. What he was drinking, the way he was acting, the notes, all of these things, add up to this myth of a man who has been, really Hollywoodized. I don't think that's the right word, but really put onto this pedestal of being this person who looks an awful lot like Bing Crosby from one of the sketches. And but who do you think this guy was? Really? Do you think he was trying to do something that people would talk about 50, 60, maybe 100 years time, because maybe we don't get there and people are still going, who was this guy? Like Jack the Ripper, all these years later, people are wound up.
I think it's a great question. Who was the real D.B. Cooper? Not, specifically a name, but just kind of as a persona. Yeah, to be sure, I've said that D.B. Cooper basically is made out to be James Bond in a way. There's a James Bond-esque element to it. And, hey, I mean, I'm like every other person. I love James Bond, and that's kind of a cool thought. But the truth be told, the more that I've investigated this and come to learn about D.B. Cooper, I believe that he was basically just a random guy. I think he was a smart guy. I think he was pretty bright, well educated. But I think he was basically just a pretty random, generic, normal person, all things considered. I think he's the kind of person where if his neighbors learned that, Bob was the real D.B. Cooper, they would be shocked. They'd be like, Bob was D.B. Cooper? It's kind of like the last guy on earth that you would expect to be D.B. Cooper. So he just kind of strikes me as somebody who was, again, probably a metallurgist, about 50 years of age, again, well-educated. There was a big downturn in the aerospace sector in the United States in 1971 specifically. And, tens of thousands of white-collar employees lost their jobs that were affiliated with the aerospace sector. It wouldn't surprise me if he was one of those individuals sort of swept up into that. And, again, put yourself in D.B. Cooper's shoes. There's a guy who's maybe about 50 years old. All of a sudden, he's out of a job. It's been a pretty good job, pretty good paying job. And his prospects are pretty dim. He's at a tough age in life. He doesn't have that many more years left before he's got to retire, but maybe he's not financially positioned well. He doesn't know how he's going to replace that income anytime soon. So I think he just... I actually think he was likely inspired by another skyjacker. There was a guy named Paul Cini, C-I-N-N-I or C-I-N-I. I'm not sure how he spelled his name, but Paul Cini, who tried skyjacking an Air Canada flight 11 days earlier. It was either 11 or 13 days earlier. And, basically he was unsuccessful, but he tried to, wanted parachutes and money and all that kind of stuff. And it was well reported in the United States at the time. So I tend to believe that D.B. Cooper was probably sitting around in his, Barco lounger in his house trying to figure out what am I going to do? I'm in a tough spot. And was, read about this Paul Cini guy and was inspired by him to pull it off. He probably thought, you know what? I could actually pull this off and be successful. And apparently that's exactly what happened. It's the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. history. And we really officially don't know anything about the guy, where he came from, where he went, whether he lived, whether he died, what his name is, anything at all. Even where he landed, we don't really know. It's really remarkable how little we officially know about this guy.
Let me ask you a couple of questions and just tell me what you think. So the name Dan Cooper, do we think this was linked to the, comic magazine Dan Cooper? Do you think that is coincidence, or do you think there was something in the name?
I tend to believe it was coincidence. Dan Cooper is just a very popular, name. It's not that uncommon. Yeah. So I tend to think it's coincidence. At least to that degree. There is an interesting, one of the places that I looked at was a place called Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee. Very near where Morgan Wallen is from, if you're a country music fan. Yeah. But, which I am. I'm a big Morgan Wallen fan. But, so there was a place there at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and there was a guy who worked there who had a brother named Dan Cooper, ironically exact same name, who a handful of years before was accidentally killed by the police, which was kind of it was a notable event in that town, that area. So I've thought maybe perhaps some kind of like that, the name event like that, and the name Dan Cooper had something to motivated him to use the name Dan Cooper. I doubt the comic book had anything to do with it. it's probably just something that's just completely random, like Mike Smith, or something like that.
What about his aviation knowledge / obviously the ability to use parachutes successfully, let's say?
Well, that took a little bit of homework on his part. Now, it's not necessarily intuitive, like if you've never seen a parachute before, putting it on and everything else. But having said that, it's also not rocket science. There's a guy named Ryan Burns who's pretty well known in the DB Cooper community as well. And he did a lot of research on the copycat people. He tried doing the thing, they saw DB Cooper do it and they got this bright idea. Hey, I'm going to do the same thing. And it's remarkable because if I'm not mistaken, a majority of the copycats had never jumped before. They had never skydived before. That was literally their first attempt. So, and they all survived. Nobody died. They all survived. So that tells you right there that you didn't have to be a skydiving expert. You didn't even have to have ever jumped before, and a little bit of homework, understanding how it works, and you got to pull the ripcord, and you're going to be okay. You can survive this thing. So now, having said all that, the guy was about 50 years old, according to the witnesses. So it wouldn't surprise me if he had some sort of experience in either World War II or Korea.
So obviously the oscillation, the plane, and they believe that's, where he jumped. But there are things, Josh Gates peddled one of them, which was about perhaps this person did not jump at that point. They stayed on, they jumped as they were coming in, to a much more populated area. Do you have any belief in any of that, or not at all?
He jumped at the time of the oscillation. That seems to be pretty clear. So he jumped about 8:11 p.m., 8:12 p.m., right around there. That seems to be that I feel very comfortable saying, and that seems pretty clear. So I do, however, think that the flight path that the FBI is working with, that was cobbled together by the U.S. Air Force about 24 hours later, trying to figure out the path that the jet actually flew, therefore where the guy could have jumped at 8:11 p.m. I do think that is slightly askew, and I've actually done a number of videos talking about how that happened and what that means for us. So the net effect of all of that is I do believe that DB Cooper jumped and landed near a town called Pigeon Springs, Washington, which is a little north, meaning about a dozen miles north of the northern edge of the FBI search area. When they had this kind of box, the search area zone, that they figured he probably jumped and landed somewhere around there. And I think that they were close, but they were a little too far south. I think in reality, DB Cooper jumped a little further north, and that's based upon a flawed FBI flight path.
How far is that to Tena Bar?
That, as the crow flies, Pigeon Springs to Tena Bar as the crow flies, is probably somewhere around 30 miles.
Okay.
That's quite a distance. So for many years, I thought DB Cooper had to have landed near where the money was found, had to have landed at Tena Bar, because Tena Bar is basically on an island. In reality, it's a peninsula, but it's, for all intents and purposes, it's on an island. It's not an easy place to get to. You can't really walk to it as a practical matter. But as I looked through it and analyzed the data, I looked at everything and analyzed all kinds of things. I just came to the conclusion ultimately that it's just impossible. He just couldn't have landed near there. So it does appear that where he actually jumped and landed was this Pigeon Springs area, an area that has never been searched. And I'll be searching there again, like I said, within a month here, looking for a parachute or whatever. But it does kind of lend itself to sort of this enigmatic nature of the $6,000 that was found at Tena Bar. Like, how did the money get there? Why is it there? What happened? And it's kind of one of those things where your guess is as good as mine, but it seems to be pretty apparent that for whatever reason, he made his way to Tena Bar, whether it be by boat or by car, after the jump, the night of the jump, and then buried the money temporarily before he, I presumably went back and, caught a flight somewhere or did whatever he had to do, or, went back home, or whatever the case may happen, to be re-engaged with society. Let's put it that way. Seems to be the case, but boy, that is a mystery in and of itself. How the Tena Bar situation ties in with it all.
Clear up one piece of information about the weather that night. What was the weather like?
It wasn't bad at all. It was a typical Pacific Northwest fall evening. I lived in the Seattle area for several years, so I've seen a lot of it. But it was, at 10,000 feet, it's, a little bit below freezing up there, kind of drizzly and wet. At ground level, the temperature was around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Off the top of my head, I don't know what that translates to centigrade or whatever, but, 39, 40 degrees. And it was just kind of a drizzly kind of night and a little bit breezy and windy at times. So it was just standard. It wasn't, it wasn't a raging storm or anything of that nature, So, and I know people like to build it out to be something of that caliber, but in reality, it just simply wasn't. D.B. Cooper had to know in advance that this is what he was signing up for. This is what he was getting himself into, that he's going to be jumping into a sort of a dreary evening in the Pacific Northwest, November evening. And, that it's going to be a little chilly and wet and damp and all that kind of stuff. But, for a lot of reasons, is actually the ideal time to do it.
Okay. So we're left with some interesting conclusions that, the money and the testing that's taken place, and it's a bit of an anomaly, but it appears to have been buried purposefully. And I absolutely believe that if you returned, at night or something to get it back at some other point, how you could leave some of it behind. Absolutely. I could, that is as feasible as any other, logical explanation, along with that it somehow flew out or whatever. But yes, it'd have had to have got buried, and there's a whole rabbit hole there. But I think your theory is absolutely solid. I also think, the tie and the work you've done in trying to define really where these particles could have come from, with little to no help from obviously the FBI, who really could make a massive dent in this case and getting solved by letting new technology have a go at it, which they don't even have to pay for. So I hope you continue with that and get somewhere. Maybe there'll be a change of guard. And, all it takes is a president who is very interested in D.B. Cooper. I don't know who that could be, but, it's they go, I want this solved. Who is it? And but
I may just have to throw my hat in the ring and see if I can become president. Then I would open it up.
But I remember them asking Obama about UFOs and aliens, and he was like, I think his response was a great one, and it went a little bit like this, to badly paraphrase it. If that's the worst thing that's being covered up, in all of history, I could believe, he said, I could believe I've seen bigger ones, and you kind of go, yeah, okay. And, who knows what's going on, but
it would be nice if they would deal us a solid here. It would be nice if the FBI, somebody would reach out and say, hey, listen, Eric, let's, and even if it's quietly, I understand maybe you don't want publicity. That's fine. Let's just do it quietly and let's see what we come up with. And, this is how I look at it. What's the downside? There really isn't any downside as far as I'm concerned. To me, it's all upside. I just think it looks good from a PR point of view. The FBI working with, private citizens to help solve mysteries that they're no longer interested in and don't want to expend public resources on. And moreover, the upside also retains the possibility that it actually solves the case. How nice would that be for the FBI to step up to the podium and basically say, hey, we had a forward-thinking agent, Heidi Johnson, who convinced us to give Eric and his DNA specialist access to the tie, and it solved the case, and the FBI's labs verified this, and we can close the book on DB Cooper now 55 years later. I mean, you would think that they would relish the opportunity to do that, and of course they would be deserving of credit as well in the case of this fictional special agent Heidi Johnson. So it doesn't have to be a situation where they walk out feeling like there's egg on their face or whatever because some dude from Rhode Island happened to figure out, a way to solve the case. But having said that, up to this point, they've been unwilling to do it.
So do you think, I think you said earlier on, you do not believe that the true identity of DB Cooper has been identified in any of these people who have been put forward?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of people that I've been looking into, and I'm not. I mean, publicly, I haven't said anything, and I'm not going to say anything until I'm a little more sure. So, I mean, it's possible that we know I know who the real DB Cooper is, but publicly, at least the names that have been tossed out there and the suspects and people of interest, all those kind of things, up to this point, nobody publicly, I believe, was DB Cooper. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question that I asked someone on another investigation, and I wonder if you can give me your answer to this. So, two things. First of all, if I could give you the answer to it all, hand it over, but it was completely opposing to everything that you believe. I mean, everything is in this book, and it leads to someone, and you go, damn. Is the mystery more compelling than the answer?
I would relish the opportunity to know who the guy was, even if I'm proven wrong. I'm a human being. I don't walk on water. I've made plenty of mistakes in life, and I'm going to make plenty more in life. And embracing those mistakes and those failures in any form, I find to be very, very liberating. I'm 60 years old now. I've lived, pretty long life at this point, 60 years. Hopefully I got many more years to come.
Sure.
And I tell you, I like to learn something new every single day. I've said that if I live to be 100, I hope I learn something on that very last day on Earth. So I'm not afraid to learn. I'm not afraid to learn the truth. I'm not afraid to be wrong. I'm not afraid to change a theory or whatever the case may happen to be. I think that's being intellectually honest is the only way to be, and it's all but certain that it's going to require somebody who's intellectually honest to ultimately crack the DB Cooper riddle.
So my final question to you, in terms of this case, what would you have to see, either from yourself or from somebody else? What would be the evidence that you would need to look at for you to shut the book?
Obviously, DNA would be one of those pieces. One of the notes. So what I mean by this is when DB Cooper had the flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, first comes, or actually it was Florence Schaffner. Let me correct myself. Florence Schaffner comes sit down next to him. He issued some demands. She wrote these demands out on, I believe, an envelope. That note with the envelope, the note with the demands, DB Cooper's demands, where it was brought to the flight deck. And at a later point, DB Cooper requested that back, and he took it with him. So obviously, if we found in somebody's attic the note written in Florence Schaffner's hand, well, that would be pretty compelling evidence. Moreover, if we happen to find the money, because the serial numbers for these bills have been recorded. They're one of a kind, there's only one serial number, these are all unique to these bills. So that obviously is equivalent to DNA in terms of saying, okay, this is the real ransom. And, is it plausible that Grandpa Joe was DB Cooper? That's how we acquired this DB Cooper money. So I think it's that sort of thing. As to whether or not we're actually ever going to be able to attain that level of assuredness, I'm really not sure. I suspect it's going to be something less than that. It's going to be a situation where we've got a very compelling circumstantial case where you're like 99% sure, which by definition means there's a 1% chance you're wrong. But I suspect ultimately it'll probably be something like that as opposed to the, trillion to one kind of a thing, with the DNA or something of that nature.
Do you think DB Cooper would think we're all nuts? That this is just outrageous, that people celebrate him and there's a convention, different things, and people are doing these podcasts talking about some random thing. Do you think he'd just be laughing? Just think it's hilarious? Or
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, it's kind of like, it's remarkable. It's remarkable to consider that this guy, who, again, I think was just basically an average Joe, is actually one of the most famous people in the world. And he's been one of the most famous people for over 50 years now. And, I'm certain that he lived, well past the skyjacking. So he had to see his fame building, albeit anonymously, over the intervening years. And boy, doesn't that inform you or tell you something about the way this guy thought, that he didn't take the bait? Because everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame, it appears, except DB Cooper. So that is really interesting, and I think it tells you something about the way this guy thought and who he was, because apparently he was okay with going to the grave being literally the only person in the world that knew that he was the famous or infamous DB Cooper.
I think what you're doing is great. I hope you continue. I hope you find something up in Washington State. I hope that you get to do that testing. And whoever it is, it's been long enough now that they're either no longer here or they're at a very, elderly age. And I hope that that person is identified and, whether take credit for what they did and whether that's, appropriate, as this was a crime fundamentally. But it's still utterly compelling. That person, just like some of the other infamous people who have lived, would go down in history. And I hope you can close the book on this one. I would love to know who it is. So please find out.
Well, I hope I'm the guy too. And, again, this kind of comes full circle to just the way I think, and it dovetails into the kid who tried to solve the Rubik's Cube, or the guy who ended up playing professional blackjack trying to beat the casino at their own game. At the end of the day, I just relish the challenge of being the one person to do the one thing that nobody else has been able to do, and that's figure out who this guy actually was.
I don't have any skin in the game, as someone I know would say. So, I am totally open for it to be anybody. And I like that answer you gave about, if you're wrong, you're wrong. But what you're doing is, it's really fascinating. I think you are pursuing lines of inquiry which are genuinely worthwhile. And I thank you for your time. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. It's been, it's been a great conversation.
Well, my pleasure anytime. And if we find something up there in Washington State or somewhere else for that matter, I'll make sure that we reach out to you and let you know about it.
Oh, please do.